Hey guys, and welcome back. Or if you're new around here, hi, my name's Georgia, and on my platforms on the internet, I talk about true crime and history. It's concerning to me just how often the world of medical history seems to intersect with true crime, how I never seem to run out of ideas for episodes in this specific genre. But today I want to talk about the poisonous medicine that killed at least 105 people, in a time when there were no regulations as to whether a medicine had to be tested before it was released to the public. In fact, there were so few regulations that in the end the makers of the medicine in question today got done for mislabeling, not for death. But it became pretty clear after this whole fiasco that things had to change, and this led to the modern version of the FDA, the US Food and Drug Administration. But first, I want to say a huge thank you to Midas Merge for sponsoring this video. Midas Merge is a new mobile game focusing on the addictive fun of merging. You merge all of these adorable creatures to hatch new ones and discover unique evolutions and abilities, as you help King Midas and Queen Leah in their journey to restore the Gardens of Gold. As you progress through the levels or through the gardens, you use the Vault of Riches to find different kinds of treasure that you can use to decorate and advance your garden. And as a design girly myself, I love this aspect of the game. Well, that and the merging of these really cute animals to create even cuter animals. Like, does anybody else find themselves getting overly attached to fictional animals and fictional characters? Like, I get to a point where I can't distinguish between real and game. Like, put a big cute pair of eyes on an animal and I will cry over them. Like, the animals in this game are so cute. Midas Merge is a low-stakes, relaxing game with a deep and immersive backstory that you uncover as you progress through the levels. I've been loving playing this just before bed to switch my brain off and just forget about the stresses of the day. But do watch out, because before you know it, you've been playing the game for like 2 hours and it's 2 a.m. and you really need to go to bed. Which seems correct because Midas Merge was created by the same designer of The Sims 3 and The Sims 4, and I am such a Sims girly, like you can really tell in the level of detail in this game. If you want to download Midas Merge for yourself for free and find your new favourite creature friend, you can use the link down below or the QR code on screen right now. And with that, let's go back to the story. Let's go back to the very beginning in 1953, when a new drug called sulfanilamide was discovered. A French team of scientists were experimenting with a new antibiotic on the scene called Prontosil, and they found that the Prontosil compound actually breaks in half after it's swallowed, and it was only half of that that effectively treated humans, and that half was sulfanilamide. And yay, now they had a new drug that could be sold. Even better that the patent for this had expired years earlier, so this was a free-for-all for anyone to make medicine with. Whilst penicillin had been discovered at this point and it was in use, it was still pretty hard to come across because for penicillin you needed the correct penicillium mould, and that was still pretty hard to come by, but sulfanilamide, that was easy. Jump forward to 1937 when a man called Samuel Evans Massengill, the head of the S.E. Massengill Company, a drug company, realised there was a big demand for liquid forms of medicine, which was generally easier to take than tablets or powder form, especially for families with small children. Sulfanilamide was one of the most in-demand antibiotics at this point, but in its natural form, it was so dry, people struggled to take it. But put it in a liquid though, and all their issues would be solved, and then they could sell more. So Massengill tasked Harold Watkins, his head chemist, to come up with a liquid formula in which they could sell sulfanilamide, and he did exactly that. Watkins played around with some ingredients and found that an ingredient called diethylene glycol could successfully dissolve the sulfanilamide powder, and it just so turned out that DEG, as it was known, was already sweet, which worked out very nicely for him. Watkins just added a bit of caramel, a bit of raspberry flavouring, and with that, they were good to go. They had liquid sulfanilamide. The solution was sent to a control lab who checked the flavour, the scent and the appearance, and they quickly approved it. There was no legal obligation for them to actually check whether or not the drug worked, or that it was even safe for human consumption. At this time in the 30s, it was recognised by professionals that the Food and Drugs Act of 1906, under which they were acting, was obsolete, but nobody had come up with an alternative yet. There were a lot of doctors and pharmacists and scientists all across the country who did believe that medications or anything for human consumption should be subject to more thorough testing, but there was nothing written in the law. So companies like Samuel Massengill's were well within their rights to just send out untested medicines. Like, they could do it legally. The only repercussions if things went wrong would be on their reputation, but it wasn't illegal. So, in September 1937, 633 shipments of this new drug were sent out across the country under the name of elixir sulfanilamide. It was said to be effective in the treatment of streptococcal infections, just as the tablet and powder form had been before it. But what nobody was aware of, what nobody was under any obligation to check, was that DEG was highly poisonous to both animals and humans. I mean, today you'll often find it used in antifreeze and paint stripper. And this wasn't necessarily something that was common knowledge at this time. Like, Watkins wouldn't have known this, nor would he have been expected to know this. But there were journals out there stating the dangers of DEG. It was known to cause kidney damage or kidney failure. So when they sent the elixir out, they didn't know it was poison, but they would very quickly realise. The symptoms of the poisoning were pretty horrific. It would take maybe 1 to 3 weeks to kill you, probably less if you were a child, and it was slow and painful. It's estimated that as many as 8 in 10 people who ingested this elixir died after experiencing symptoms characteristic of kidney failure. So no urination, severe abdominal pain, nausea, vomiting, stupor and convulsions. And on top of this, a constant awful pain. There was no known antidote for DEG poisoning at this time. Like, once it was in action, there was very little that could be done. So once you took this drug, that was it. On the 11th of October, reports started to come in to the American Medical Association from physicians in Tulsa, Oklahoma, saying there had been a number of deaths in people who had taken this elixir. Luckily, they took it seriously immediately, and the AMA asked for samples of the drug in question before contacting the Massengill Company and asking for the composition of the compound. From there, it didn't take long for them to realise that the diethylene glycol was the guilty ingredient, and they immediately released a warning through newspaper and radio that elixir sulfanilamide was toxic and deadly, that people needed to stop taking it immediately. It wasn't until the 14th of October, so 3 days later, that a doctor from New York even thought to notify the FDA. Like, that's how far removed they were from things like this, which is crazy to think nowadays. From there, they sent inspectors out to San Francisco, New York, Kansas City, and to the Massengill headquarters in Bristol, Tennessee. They got Massengill to send telegrams to more than 1,000 salesmen, druggists and doctors, in which they asked them to return all the elixir sulfanilamide that they had. But that was it, despite the Kansas City inspector already confirming that 1 adult and 8 children had died. And that was just the beginning. This first notice of Massengill's really failed to get across the urgency of the situation, that this drug was fatal and people needed to stop taking it with immediate effect. So the FDA then made them send out a second message. This second message read, "Imperative you take up immediately all elixir sulfanilamide dispensed. Product may be dangerous to life. Return all stocks are expense." And then it was the FDA's job to ensure that every single remaining bottle of this drug was retrieved from homes all across the country. 239 FDA inspectors and chemists were given this job alongside both state and local health officials. They checked company shipping records, they went to the distribution houses and checked their lists, they went to wholesale and retail drugstores, and they checked through thousands of order slips, trying to track down each and every person who bought a bottle. They also tried to track down every single one of the company's salesmen, but the entire nature of a salesman is that they kind of move around constantly. The FDA literally had agents chasing salesmen down country roads, turning up at their hotels. Like, this is how seriously they were taking this. They did eventually manage to contact them all, but even then it wasn't easy. Like, some of them were very hesitant about sharing the distribution information. I don't know who would hear about people dying of a drug that you are selling and then still refuse to share the relevant information in order to literally save people's lives, but one man actually had to be put in jail by state authorities before he shared anything. Another problem they came across is that the elixir wasn't a prescription-only drug. Some pharmacists just sold it off the shelves and didn't need to keep track of who they sold it to. And when it was prescribed by doctors, they didn't always keep the best records. They found, for example, that in East St. Louis in Illinois, 49 prescriptions were written out for elixir sulfanilamide, and on some, all they had was just Betty Jane, 9 months old, and Mrs. Jackson, no address. So tracking all this down took some real detective work. Inspectors literally turned up to people's homes to take the bottles out of their hands. And when you're dealing with the general public, they're never really going to make it easy. One big problem was some of the buyers had already heard of the dangers of the elixir and they'd gone to the trouble of disposing of the bottles themselves, but that wasn't really enough evidence for the FDA. Like, they needed to know that these sort of bottles were destroyed, that the liquid was gone, nobody's going to drink it. Like, one woman apparently told them that she destroyed the bottle, and after further questioning, it was found that she'd simply thrown the bottle out of the window into a neighbouring alley, where the inspectors found it still in perfect condition, just ready for any curious child to pick up and drink and die. And whilst most doctors were very helpful and very open about who they prescribed the drug to, some were a bit more shady, probably out of fear of repercussions if people had died. There was one doctor in South Carolina who told an inspector that he'd only prescribed it to 5 people and none of them had died, but a little bit more digging found that a lumber mill employee in the town had died of very similar symptoms to the poisoning. Turns out he had been prescribed the elixir by this very doctor and he died from it. They literally found the bottle on his grave along with the rest of his medical equipment as per local custom. In total, 4 of those doctors' patients died. None of the doctors were in trouble, like none of them knew that they were prescribing poison, but holding back this information could have led to more deaths, to more people taking the elixir before it could be confiscated. In total, there had been 240 gallons made of elixir sulfanilamide, and the FDA miraculously managed to get back 234 gallons and 1 pint. That's just over 5 gallons that were never recovered, and most of that would have been ingested. The inspectors were literally trawling the country trying to find small bottles of medicine, like needles in a haystack, and they did it. They found everything that was left. It's estimated there was enough there to kill 4,000 people, and in the end, 105 people died. That's 105 more people than should have died, but this whole thing had the potential to be much, much worse. Thanks to the commitment of the FDA, they saved a lot of lives. And as I pointed out at the beginning of this episode, this was not illegal. Massengills hadn't done anything wrong by producing this drug. But people had died, multiple children had died, the families were screaming out for some kind of justice. You see, for an elixir to officially be an elixir, it must be an alcoholic solution containing ethyl alcohol, and this didn't. If they'd branded it as a solution instead, the FDA would literally have been able to do nothing, and that includes going to seize the drug from across the country. Had Massengill called this a sulfanilamide solution, the drug would have remained in people's medicine cabinets, just waiting for the next time that somebody had a sore throat. Dr. Samuel Massengill released a statement saying, "My chemist and I deeply regret the fatal results, but there was no error in the manufacture of the product. We have been supplying a legitimate professional demand and not once could have foreseen the unlooked for results. I do not feel that there was any responsibility on our part." Which does seem cold, but of course a company is not going to take responsibility for this. It would just tank their entire reputation. But it seems his head chemist, Harold Watkins, didn't agree. He reportedly ended his own life after being unable to live with what had happened. In the end, the FDA were able to arrest Massengill and charge him with misbranding under the Pure Food and Drugs Act of 1906. Initially, he did plead not guilty and was kept on a $25,000 bond, but in October 1938, just a year later as the pressure grew, he changed his plea to guilty. In the end, he was fined $26,000, which is just over $500,000 in today's money, which does seem like a small price to pay for 105 lives. In the aftermath of all this, the FDA Commissioner Walter Campbell did press for better federal regulation of drugs, and by March 1938, just 6 months after the deaths, the Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act of 1938 was introduced to the Senate. By June, it was in front of President Roosevelt, who signed it into law. From then on, USA citizens should be protected from unsafe medications. I mean, it still wasn't perfect, there were a lot of loopholes, and the FDA didn't have nearly as much power as they actually needed, but it was a start. With this, the FDA had only 60 days to block an unsafe drug from being sold, and even then they weren't actually allowed to ensure the quality of the medications. But then the 1960s came around with thalidomide. Thalidomide affected huge parts of Europe. Mothers were being prescribed a safe sickness drug that caused children to be born with limb deformities. And the USA had a very lucky escape when a member of the FDA team, Frances Oldham Kelsey, noticed the substantial lack of safety evidence for thalidomide, and she refused to approve it for use in the country, despite there being plenty of pressure to do so. Through this, she saved so many children, so many mothers, and she inspired new legislation, the Harris-Kefauver Amendment of 1962, which made the provision of safety and efficacy information mandatory for all medications. It also defined the distinct phases required of any clinical research trial. So finally, with the 1960s, there was reassurance that the drugs you were taking weren't going to kill you. But it took a long time to get there. People are always resistant to change. Like, it seems crazy now, doesn't it, that there were medical professionals, doctors, pharmacists out there who advocated against safety testing for drugs. But it happens all the time. Like when seatbelts became a thing, people were up in arms. When it became illegal to drink drive, people were furious. This was just another step in history. It's just a shame so many people had to die for us to get here. Still, things like this happen all the time, but I suppose a lot of the time you don't know the true dangers of something until people do sadly end up dying from it. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I hope you guys found this one as interesting as I did. We all know how much I love a bit of gory medical history over here. A huge thank you to Midas Merge for sponsoring this video. Again, please make sure to check it out in the description box down below. And thanks for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.